Thank you very much, Merle. It's very nice to be here with Mark to present this talk. I'm going to share my screen and without further ado, talk about modeling group movement synchronization. So it's myself, Alan Wing from the University of Birmingham, Mark Elliott from the University of Warwick.
Hi, everyone.
Our talk's in two parts. I'm going to talk first. It's really about trained musical performance and timing amongst members of ensembles. And the second part by Mark is going to be about spontaneous activities. Again, it's about the timing between members participating in those more spontaneous activities. So in my talk, on part one, I'm going to be saying a little bit about music performance with a live recorded demo. And then I'll talk about some lab tapping studies with expert tappers. And then I'll go on to back to a real life musical ensemble example, which is based on data from a couple of quartets. So in music performance, the main elements of music, which everybody will be familiar with, are pitch, timbre, and texture, volume, duration, and form. And all these taken together with cooperation between the four players, for example, in a quartet as shown on the right by Haydn, we have that sense of ensemble, them playing together, of listening to each other and adjusting to each other. And today what I'm going to do is focus on timing and look at the range of durations and the intervals between note onsets that players make as they make tempo adjustments, both voluntary and perhaps involuntary, as they work towards sharing a pulse in the music. So the demo I'm going to take you through involves a Synchro quartet, a UK international professional quartet. And the demo was carried out at Little Missenden Music Festival last year. So we've got, first of all, the four players playing simultaneously an excerpt from Haydn. And we're going to listen to the recording of that. And what I think we'll agree is that their onset asynchronies, so here we've got 4 lines of acoustic products of the performers playing the music, are very well aligned. The note onsets don't seem to be misaligned. They don't seem to be variable at all. And then what we're going to do, by contrast, is have another way of getting an ensemble, which I think you'll agree sounds very different. So we recorded each of the 4 players playing their parts separately. So the quartet was close mic'd and each played their piece separately. And we played back the tracks aligned on the start note. And so the first note was aligned perfectly. They had a click track to bring them in at the right tempo when they were making their single track recordings. And what we'll listen to is what emerges as a developing asynchrony. So here we go. Now this time they're going to play their parts separated. We'll just hear a bit of the violin, first violin. And skip to the beginning of the cello. So now what we do is take the 4 recorded tracks, align them on the first note. That's the Synchro quartet as you never heard them before. So when we take music, which in each of those players was at a set tempo, and the click track brought them in all at the same speed, and then allow them to play, but only without listening to each other and adjusting, if we align the note onset, we find that there's a rapid drift apart, and they develop an asynchrony. And so what the point is that live music involves cooperative timing adjustments between players. There's some data on asynchrony in musical trios. This is from Rasch in 1979, looking at different groups. For example, there's recorders here, there's wind groups here, and string groups here. And this is looking at the mean onset asynchrony in each playing 2 different pieces of music. And you see the mean onset asynchrony is around about 0, but there is a range for different instruments. Quite often, for example, with the violin taking the lead and the cello perhaps being the last in line. But if we look at the variability, the standard deviation shows quite clearly that both for recorders, wind trio, and the string trios, there's quite a lot of variability. This is the standard deviation of the note onset asynchronous between the players. And it's running for the string trio up around about 40 or 50 milliseconds of variability. That's 1600 milliseconds squared. So that is significant variability. It's not part of normal playing. These were good quartets. So in studying timing in the lab, we think about variability of timing, what's happening here. So I've done a number of experiments picking up on a paradigm by Stevens from way back in 1886 using a Morse code key. He asked people to tap in time to a metronome, and then he asked them to tap on their own. And he would look at the intervals between their responses on the metronome, measure them, and look at the variability or characterize the nature of the variation. And he found, as we found repeatedly, that tap intervals are variable. And what's more, the variability increases with longer intervals. And one way of characterizing or thinking about this is to say, well, there's a mental clock in the head. We can think about time intervals. And if we want, we can couple them up to the motor system. And if we want, we can make taps, we can stop, and we can keep tapping in phase with that mental timekeeper in the head. And each of these components, the mental clock in the head and the motor system, which is mediating between the clock and the overt tap you can measure, has some variability. It turns out if you use the wing Christopherson model, which dissociates clock and motor variability, the clock variability increases with the longer intervals, but the motor variability stays remarkably constant across intervals. So this is a model of timing which has two components. Now we think about, well, if you've got to tap with a metronome, what are you going to do? You've got to get your responses, your taps on the Morse code key in line with the metronome pulses. And that means you've got to keep these asynchronies down to a minimum. And indeed, what we propose, or this is picking up really from the work of Forberg, is a feedback model, a simple linear feedback model on phase correction. So each time you tap and your tap response comes out here from the clock and motor system, you have a comparison with the pulse that is produced as an asynchrony. So this audio feedback allows you to make a correction to the phase of the clock to adjust its timing for the next response. But the proportion of that correction may not be 100%, it may be a partial correction, and there'd be some feedback correction gain for alpha. And this setting of the value for alpha would be critically dependent on whether you use small alphas and you get undercorrection, or you get large alphas and overcorrections as to which type of variation you get in tapping. And now, if the metronome interval changes unexpectedly, if the metronome skips a beat or something like this, this model will also keep you in time with an unreliable metronome. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next slide. This is a study where we looked at metronomes that were producing unpredictable phase shift. So somewhere in the sequence, here lined up on time t, the 500 millisecond intervals suddenly switched either by one interval which was a bit shorter or one interval that was a bit longer by 50 milliseconds. And then the interval was again 500 milliseconds. And what this does is phase shifts all the subsequent pulses being produced by the metronome with respect to the pre-phase shift events. And so it's 50 milliseconds added or 50 milliseconds subtracted. This phase shift then produces a change in behavior. So when people are tapping with these metronome pulses, typically in these sort of experiments, people tend to lead the beat. So they've got a lead of 40 milliseconds until the phase shift occurs. The phase shift throws them either even earlier if it's a delay, or later if it's a phase advance. But then what we see is rapidly afterwards, the correction brings them back to the pre-phase shift asynchrony that was observed before the phase shift. But it doesn't immediate. So on the very first response after the phase shift, there's still some error left, and it takes a couple of responses to get back to the same baseline. So that means there's some undercorrection. The alpha is not as big as it could be to get you right back on target straight away. There's an interesting part about this experiment that I was just showing you there, was that we were taking EEG recordings at the same time. And we were interested in an area in the frontal cortex which shows up an error-related negativity in other experiments. And we were looking at the voltage difference between this peak, positive down, positive peak, followed by this negative peak, looking at this amplitude, the error-related negativity in the context of this tapping task. And what we can see is that this error-related negativity shows a sign difference and a recovery, which very much parallels the behavioral data. So we've got evidence here of the brainwaves of the neurophysiological underpinnings of the overt behavior. I'm now going to go into the musical case again and think about ensemble timing. So we take this audio feedback phase correction model that we were using for keeping in time with the metronome and say, well, what if we say, for example, the first violin trying to judge when to make the next note? What if that first violin looks at the asynchrony with the second violin, asynchrony with the viola, asynchrony with the cello? They can apply a correction to each of these to make a weighted adjustment according to the weight that you give each of these other players, and then produce the new interval. So this kind of a weighted correction could give more weight, for example, to the second violin, less weight to the viola and the cello, because perhaps the first violin doesn't trust the timing of the other two players to the same degree. So this kind of a model, this simple linear phase adjustment model, involves 12 correction parameters. There are 3 alphas for each of the 4 players, 3 correction parameters for each of the 4 players. So you get this sort of network diagram of who is depending on whom and how strongly. So we then took this model, and just to show a little bit further how it works, we say, what if you've got different values of alpha? So it turns out that as you vary alpha along this dimension, the variance that you would get, given a certain amount of timing variance and motor delay variance, changes. And it turns out the optimal level, the gain value that gives you the minimum amount of asynchrony variance is 1 over the number of players, 1/4 in this case, it's 0.25. And if you are more variable, then you will be more, sorry, if you are using less gain, you will be more variable in the asynchronous. If you're using more gain, you will be more variable with the asynchronous. And the nature of the variation will change. So if you're using under correction, low values of gain, you'll tend to get this kind of drifting behavior. And if you're using optimal gain, let's say this case, it'll stay around the mean much more reliably. If there's an intrinsic greater variance in the players' timing systems, then it will still remain around 0, but oscillate more. We can listen to these. For example, this one where there's low feedback correction gain sounds like this. This is a little bit faster, but it's the same piece by Haydn played on a synthesizer. Well, they ended up together, but I think everybody could hear that it was drifting away from the beat, that they were not together in the middle. Whereas if we play this version, which is staying in time and is using an optimal gain, perhaps what you would say is that sounded a little bit robotic, a little bit too perfect, but there was some variability. It is the case that in the music industry that there's been, for over a number of years now, a tendency to try to introduce noise into synthesized performance to make it sound a little bit more human-like. So if we add a little bit more noise, but use the same correction system optimally, well, we could hear there that there were some departures, but they always kept together. So that maybe was a little bit more human, or maybe a little bit more amateur, however you like to put it. So we did an experiment to look at alphas in performance of this same excerpt in professional quartets. And we asked them to play the excerpt, which is shown here with 44 notes running over a series of homophonic quavers being played by all the players, to vary their expressive style from one trial to the next, and not to rehearse that variation in expressive style. So they really had to listen to each other to keep together. And then we recorded the performance with close mics and got the note onset times. And from these, we estimated the values of alpha. So that here we have then the alpha values estimated for 2 international quartets, where we're interested in how does the violin, the second violin, viola, and cello depend on each other from these alpha gain values that we've estimated. I should say one quartet is German, and the other quartet is from the UK. And in this case, what we see for the German quartets, and what we're looking at is here, for example, the first violin's dependence on green, violin 2, the first violin's dependence on yellow, viola, and the first violin's dependence on the cello. And we notice that the first violin's dependence on the other instruments tends to be less than their dependence on the first violin, higher, higher, and higher. And what's more, if you take as a group, there is higher dependence in between among the other players in the body of the ensemble. And this perhaps reflects the idea that the first violin is the leader, the first violin has the melody. Here we have the UK quartet, and we see a slightly different pattern. So if we look at the first violin, we see overall the level is still below the absolute optimum, but a bit closer to the optimum of 0.25, let's say. But we notice now that this first violin is using correction factors against the other players, which sort of matches the overall correction factors being used by the other players towards him in this case. So then in the end, what we can summarize this first part is saying that the timing is inherently variable. There's both intended and unintended timing components. And we can use metronome pace timing, look at rapid correction for phase shift, and estimate alpha from that. And we get EEG indices that monitor, that indicate that correction process. In the ensemble, the members all share responsibility for synchronization. And the degree of correction, the alpha value, may differ between different pairs of players in a quartet and between quartets. So at this point, I hand over to Mark. And Mark's going to tell me when I have to make each new slide.
I'll try and quickly share my screen, or we'll see if we can do it.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Easier. So continue. I'll do it as quick as I can.
You've got the latest version, haven't you, Mark?
Yeah. Right, can everyone see that? All okay. Right. So Alan's talked mainly about musical performance. This part of the talk is looking at more spontaneous synchrony, because quite often we see people moving together in more sort of natural, spontaneous situations. And there's some examples here. On the left-hand side, we've got a football crowd all jumping up and down excitedly together in a stadium. And also we see quite commonly when people walk together as a group as well, people start to fall into step with each other. And a famous example in the UK now 20 years ago was when they opened the Millennium Bridge, and people fell into step, and the lateral forces from them all walking in sync affected the stability of the bridge. So we wanted to recreate some experiments that mimicked these sort of more group spontaneous synchrony activities. So we set up two experiments. One was a bouncing experiment where people were bouncing in synchrony together, and one was a group walking experiment. And then we use a slightly different event-based measure compared to the one Alan's just talked about. So the first experiment was the bouncing experiment. We got a lecture theatre with 9 participants, and they were in a 3x3 formation, so 3 people on each row, all facing forwards. It was a tiered lecture theatre, so they could see each other from behind, and we asked them to bounce on the spot. And then what we had for each trial, we set different sensory conditions during that trial. So what we started with was we asked participants to start bouncing with their eyes closed, but we provided a metronome. So they had an auditory cue to synchronize with to start with. And then after 11 seconds, we turned that metronome off, but the participants kept their eyes closed. So now they were told to maintain that same pace, but this time they were just using their own internal timing. And then finally, towards the end of the trial, we asked participants to open their eyes. The metronome stayed off, and now they were instructed to synchronize to the person directly in front of them. So this time they were using the visual cue of the person in front of them to synchronize. The way we measured their movement was to fit accelerometers around the waist of each participant. And then we extracted the times of their minimum vertical positions by double integral, and that defined their timing events. And then we used a pairwise a measure. So we used a synchrony coupling index. So this was in collaboration with Norrie Jacobi and using some of the methods he's defined. And we did this in a pairwise way. So we could look at, for each person out of those group of 9, how strongly they were coupled in terms of their synchrony to all the other 8 participants. So just to give a bit of an idea of how that worked with a synchrony coupling index. So hopefully you can see my mouse on the left here. We've got the participant response. Again, similar to what Alan's talked about, we're looking at an event-based approach where we've got timing events. So for the participant response, capital R, and then we've got timing intervals between them, which are in small r. And we also have a driving stimulus, which again is an event based, so denoted by a capital S, and the intervals of the stimulus are small s. And what we do is we take based on Norris 2012 paper, we take a recurrence equation where we predict the timing of the next interval of the participant response, first of all, just using their own interval times, so the time history of their intervals as a sum, weighted sum. We then do a second equation where we take into account the asynchronies to the driving stimulus, which is one of the other 8 people. So now we get another equation which uses both the intervals of the participant and the asynchronies to the driving stimulus, which is one of the other people. What we do then is use a regression to look at the ratio of the variance between that first equation, where we're just using the intervals, compared to the second equation where we've got the asynchronies and the intervals. And the higher that ratio shows a higher increased coupling to that other person in terms of their synchronization. We look at significance just by using a bootstrapping method and randomizing the driving stimulus events. So the results we have here a visual representation of the group. So you can see here, we look at each person in turn. So the person with the spiky hair is the one we're interested in, and then we're looking at how the other 8 people around them are influencing that person in terms of synchrony. And then we have a heat map here, which represents the strength of the synchrony coupling. So if we take the top left, for example, we've got the person at the very back on the left, and we can see that they're strongly coupled. This is in the eyes open condition. They're strongly coupled to the 2 people in front. And again, we can see that this continues throughout. So as instructed to follow the person in front of them, we can see that they were following this very well with very little peripheral input from the other people surrounding them. And then we can do that for the rest of the group. This is a directional measure, so we can see as we move to the middle row, again, they're just influenced by the person in front of them. We see some peripheral effects on the middle person here. And then when we come to the front, they've got no driving synchrony. So everyone is blue, which shows that there's no coupling. And then just to show what happens when we had the eyes closed condition, we can see that all the synchrony coupling disappears. So then we attempted this on the walking method. We want to look at this in a more spontaneous way. So whereas that previous experiment was a bit more controlled, the walking experiment was completely synchronous spontaneous in that we just asked people to walk as a group. We didn't mention anything about timing their steps together. So here we had 2x2 formation of people walking up and down a gate motion capture lab. And this time we use the heel strike events as the event times. So here's the results, and we can see that by having no particular instructions, there's much more peripheral input from the surrounding people in the group. So if we start with the back participants, we can see that there's a fairly strong coupling to both people in front of them, but also some coupling here to the person adjacent to them as well, and the same on the right hand side. At the front, we can also see, interestingly, we had a strong coupling, this is averaged across 5 groups, a strong coupling for the person on the left to the person on the right, but it wasn't bidirectional, so we only had a weaker coupling from the person on the right to the left, which could be some kind of hand dominance effect maybe. So finally, just to bring us bang up to date, so I'm now working in the area of digital healthcare, and one of the things we're looking at now is how we can help people with their physiotherapy outside of the clinic and in the home, and looking at can we use virtual reality avatars to help guide the exercises that they do. And one of the challenges we wanted to test was whether people can actually follow an avatar very accurately. So using this paradigm, we could actually test how strong their coupling of their own movements were to the avatar. So here we set up a stepping on the spot study where the avatar stepped on the spot, and we asked the participants to step on the spot in time with the avatar. on this study, we used a perturbation study. So this is similar to what Alan mentioned in his talk, where we did a phase shift of one step cycle, which was speeded up or slowed down very subtly, so that the people were stepping in phase, and then suddenly they're knocked out of phase, and we can look at the correction they make to get back into time with the avatar. So if there's a strong correction, we know that the effect of the avatar is good. If they drift away, we know that they're not really following the timing of the avatar. And then finally, we had a visual condition, which was just the avatar, and then a visual and auditory, where we had the avatar plus some footstep noises when the events occurred. So here's the results. At the top, we have the avatar only condition, and we can see where we shorten the interval at time t here. This is where the phase shifts occurred, and we can see the bigger asynchrony occurring here. But the participants do correct back in time after about 3 steps. Interestingly, when we had the lengthened interval just for the avatar only condition, they didn't seem to correct as much, and they started to drift away. So here we can see the asynchrony occur, and that remains in place for the rest of the trial. When we introduce the footstep sounds, we get a much stronger correction, and we can see that they come back in time within about 2 steps, both on the shortened and the lengthened interval. So just very quickly in summary, because I know we're a bit over time. So we can see that different event-based methods can be used to analyze group synchrony and show that strength of coupling. And just at the end there, there are some interesting applications in sort of virtual reality and the healthcare domain as well, just to see how well people can interact with virtual environments as well. So finally, just a quick mention that the methods that we use are available as an open source toolbox, and there's a accompanying book chapter as well, which is all open access and free to access online. So thank you. That's all our collaborators and contact details. So I'll hand back to Merle.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Alan. That was probably the best way to kick off. We're definitely all awake. Lots of maths, but so well explained. So we are deep in it, and I really do appreciate how well it's been put together to be able to really capture both spontaneous and more guided, so we say, ensemble movement. I have to also say we probably have to talk because we're doing very similar things with group walking, in fact. So I have probably about 600 questions. We don't have any on the YouTube stream at this point. I will keep an eye on it, but also because we're short of time. I do have a couple, and I'm going to just reduce it to one. So you spoke a lot, both of you spoke about typically pairwise coupling, both within the interdependence between the players in the string quartet, and then obviously in your group walking with eyes open and eyes shut. One of my big questions is, and obviously your data seems to suggest this, that we basically just pair to our nearest neighbors. But do you really think that that's the case? And do you think that that's the case irrespective of the size of the group? Do you mean, I assume that in a string quartet, we don't just look at the first finalists. We obviously have some degree of coupling with the others. So one of the things that sort of runs in the background is what are the group size limits to any models we make as to, pairwise coupling. As the group size increases, obviously, we probably will focus more and more just on nearest neighbors because we know that that's reliable. It's what we have access to. So basically, I want you to, could you tell us what you think about a pairwise coupling as a function of group size?
So shall I, and then Mark can answer on the...
That sounds great.
Okay, so in music, what we've been thinking about is what happens in orchestras. And so what we were saying is optimal coupling, which minimizes asynchrony variance, is to use 1 over the number of players. And that doesn't really say about which ones that you were doing. That would be the average coupling factor, 1 over n. So if you've got 60 in the orchestra, it would be very small coupling with all the other players. However, what we know in orchestras when they're being trained is that they should, first of all, synchronize with their neighbors who are playing the same instrument. So all the strings as groups, like the cellos should try to play together, the violins should try to play together. And then what we would expect, but we've not tested this yet, so it'd be an interesting experiment, we're looking for collaborators, would be that when you go to the larger scale, you'd be interested, how do the cellos coordinate, adjust their timing with respect to, I don't know, the percussion, or with the wind, or with the brass, for example. Some would say that, in fact, it's very difficult to avoid getting drawn into phase with the brass because they're much louder. So there are other factors which affect this as well.
Yeah, which it was why I was thinking we probably need to think more about layered models of coupling. Your first layer is, the people who are most important, so that you can make fine-tuned changes, and then subsequent layers, one which might be just salience-driven. You hear a big bang from the timpanist, or it's something along those lines. That we need to probably get cleverer, with more layered models. But I think that's sort of what you were saying.
Yeah. So I mean, I think on our study, it was interesting about the peripheral input as well. So when there's no instruction, like on the walking one, we could see the peripheral input. So even the person adjacent to you has some coupling. Whereas on the bouncing task, where we explicitly said follow the person in front, you could see it was very directional, and they were just literally following that person in front with very little overflow into the peripheral. So that's an interesting area. Another thing that we were looking at is the reliability of the stimulus as well. So if someone's very reliable in their timing, do you put more weight on that person because of that reliability compared to someone who maybe is more variable and harder to follow? So
But then I think it probably gets even more complicated. I should just be quiet because there are questions coming up on the YouTube stream. But I think just very briefly, that reliability is one thing, but that has to then also interact with your priors. So if you assume them to be reliable and then they sort of go against those priors, you can have a pretty interesting effect as well. But I'll leave that. But I really do think we need to talk lots, because we're doing lots of the same things. On the YouTube, we've got 2 questions, one from Travis Wiltshire, who'll be speaking later today, and one from Pedro Passos, who works on football and teams, and he'll be speaking on Friday. Travis asks a question for Alan. Any idea what the reason is for the natural or cultural pairwise differences in the quartet?
Yes.
Maybe Alan can take that.
So the German quartets were displaying a more clearly leader-directed or controlled environment than the UK quartet. So we could say one is more autocratic, the other is more democratic. But that's only with 2 quartets and only 1 piece of music and a short excerpt. So we don't really know the real range of variation. It would be premature, but one could speculate that it's something to do with the cultural upbringing.
We need to do an experiment.
Yes, it's a familiarity with Haydn, and maybe the Germans got it right and the English were doing something that Haydn would never have dreamed of.
We need to do an experiment, don't we? And then we have another one from Pedro Passos. This is a question for Mark. In the bouncing experiment, do you have any explanation why the participant in the back row displays a stronger synchronization with the front row than the middle row?
Right, okay. I haven't got a definitive answer. I'm not totally sure. The only thing it could be maybe is that the person in the front row was more less variable, because they were effectively setting the timing pace, and the person in the middle would have been following that person in front of them, and then the person at the back following that person in the middle, who maybe was more variable because they were correcting more. That's my theory, but we haven't proven that, I guess.
We're going to have to stop there. We have another question from Dan CM, and I hope that you will have a look at that, Mark, and I think it's meant for Alan. Alan, so perhaps you can have a look at that. Sure. I will thank you both once again for your time and your wonderful presentation, which has really got us off to a great start. We have